All right, very good. Are you going to say anything by way of introduction, Nick, or am I
No,
just taking over?
it's all yours.
Okay. Well, thank you. So my name is Bob Barnes, and I will be the moderator for tonight. Our topic this evening for the Interfaith Dialogue series is, in a complicated world, how do we choose between right from wrong, good from evil? So as I said, I will moderate. We're going to try a new format tonight, if I can make the technology work. And I just found out Bruce will help me if I can't make it work. So we have two panelists. They will each speak for 15 minutes. Then we'll have just a few minutes for clarifying questions, not a full discussion, because we will have time for that later this evening. So after a few minutes for the clarifying questions, we will break into breakout rooms for a small group discussion. From the numbers, it looks like we'll probably have 2 unless more people join. And I will post some starter questions in the chat box. The small groups will get about 20 minutes. Then we will bring back everybody into the large space for a sharing of perspectives, questions to the presenters or between. They can speak between themselves, and we'll just have a free-flowing discussion at that point until the rest of our time. So how does that sound to folks? I see some heads nodding. Okay, good. A lot of people who do not have cameras on at this point, but that's okay. So our first panelist will actually be Reverend Jeffrey Davis, who will speak to our question tonight. Jeff is the pastor at Concordia Lutheran Church here in Duluth, where he has served since 2017. He's previously served congregations of the ELCA in Wisconsin and North Dakota. Jeff is an avid birder. He's president of the Duluth Audubon Society. He enjoys board games and plays basketball daily, even in the winter. He is keenly interested in the theology of Rene Girard and Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So Jeff, take it away.
Well, thank you for having me. Can everybody who I can see hear me okay? Everybody can hear me okay? Excellent. All right. Well, as was mentioned, our primary question tonight is, in a complicated world, how do we choose right from wrong and good from evil? And not only is the world complicated, but so is this question. The terms that we are using within the question carry a lot of baggage with them. Usually we have understood words like right and wrong, good and evil as being primarily words of a religious nature. The terms like morality and values is language in which religious communities tend to traffic. I think popular sentiment and perception is that religious communities are all about declaring what is good and evil and policing what is right and wrong. When I think about, however, the Christian scriptures and the heritage and traditions of Lutheran Christianity, that kind of language is seldom used. Those scriptures and traditions, when they talk about how one lives in the world, tend to use other categories, categories that speak more about a particular way of life. Terms like faithful and unfaithful, righteous and wicked, just and unjust are not primarily about morality or being good or bad, but about whether they are in line with a certain way of life, a tradition, or if an action is out of bounds from that tradition or out of rhythm with that way of life. I think, though, that as Christianity moved from a largely obscure and powerless minority in its early centuries into a position of power as central to an empire, the language around ethical action shifted from being about a way of life, with way of life words like faithful and just, to being more universal, using catch-all expansive language like good and evil, right and wrong. And so the use of these broad categories marked the move from Christianity as a particular tradition with a unique ethic into a universalizing philosophy of morality at the service of empire, who can now label others not as, well, they're just living out this particular way of life, so they behave this or that way, but in a simpler, more identifiable, more easily to make into an enemy, all-encompassing way, using terms to define others and their behavior as wrong and evil. So to approach this question at all, I feel the need to dispense with some of this baggage and name the reality that much of that language of good and evil, right and wrong, is not Christianity's primary language for discerning how one acts in a complicated world. That language, I would argue, is an imposition that has now become for many the default perspective. So I would like to offer a lens more particular to Christian faith, to the particular stories and theological reflection upon those stories that inspire a way of life. As a Lutheran Christian, it's often been part of our heritage to avoid beginning with theological claims or ethical deliberation anywhere other than with the cross of Jesus. We try not to start with the abstract concept of God or of good and evil action and then see how the cross or Jesus fit into that, but start instead with the cross and the one on it to find out who God is, what God does, or how one is to behave. We call this in our tradition the theology of the cross. So that is where I'm going to begin to think about what guides our decision-making in a complicated world. When I think about the story of Jesus and the cross, I find a story of mob violence. An individual, for a variety of religious, cultural, and political reasons, is conspired against by a friend, religious, and political leadership, and selected as a person whose death is determined to be necessary in order to create peace, in order to restore balance, in order to stave off rebellion or to stifle heresy. This one is called names and cursed, mocked and derided, beaten and tortured, brutally executed through crucifixion as a public example, the goal of which is that some perceived communal good will come from his death. Jesus falls victim to the mindset of the mob that his murder will solve some problem, that everything will be better without him. Of course, the story goes on that 3 days later, Jesus is raised from the dead, which is presented as God's no to this way of thinking, as God redeems Jesus from death as a starting point for a different way of life, a different way to form community. In this story of mob violence, I perceive how much of our world creates community. In labeling a person or a group or a nation as a threat, employing lies and defamations, and using those categories of good and evil, right and wrong to define others, a scene is set where the answer to all of our problems is the removal or destruction of that group, that person, that country, whoever. Peace is won, healing is had, tradition is restored, family is united by exile or execution. I hope examples of how this is done in our world, how this plays out every day, are coming to your mind as I speak of it, but I'd like to share a couple of them with you. I think about refugees fleeing violence and difficulty in their home nation, only to arrive at a border access point to be turned away. The inhospitable welcome is part of a law and order program. The arrivals did not file the proper paperwork or protocol or get in the right line. So they leave, but they sneak across a border area another way, desperate for a life of safety. This action, however, is deemed as wrong, against the law. And when they are caught, they are detained and then sent back. Here in this example, the full force of law and order, a nation's sense of right and wrong, is employed against the vulnerable out of a sense of duty and goodness. These ones, already victimized, are further traumatized as they are sacrificed to a sense of what is right. Another example: it is revealed to a family that a beloved child is gay. Having been shaped by a religious perspective where good and evil and right and wrong are paramount, the family decides to send the child to conversion therapy. It doesn't work. but it adds further trauma to the child as the child comes to believe that their very own family sees them as evil, unnatural, and wrong. Eventually, the child comes to embrace who they are, their identity, but instead of finding themselves celebrated, they find rejection from those that supposedly are there to love them. Rather than clinging to their own child, standing with and for them, they sacrifice the relationship with their child for the sake of being right. Another example, a fringe subset of a major religious group attacks notable public symbols of a nation deemed to be an enemy. An initial response of unity gives way to little acts of division where neighbors begin to report on neighbors and even to act with violence toward people they perceive to be from that religious group. Savvy politicians recognize the growing anti-them sentiment and stoke fires of war. Fostering an us good versus them evil duality, the world is transformed into a battleground between agents of light and agents of darkness. The evil has to be rooted out and destroyed. Their death will cleanse the world. So we sacrifice our enemy to create a better world. We will even also sacrifice some of our own in the effort. As I mentioned earlier, and as some of these examples show, our ideas about morality, about what is right and wrong, good and evil, are often in service to that sacrificial mindset, to an us versus them, upon which empires depend and thrive. People are made into victims whose elimination or exile gets things back to right. In the story of the resurrection of Jesus, a victim of mob violence, a victim of the sacrificial mindset, God's reversal shows a new possibility for living together for a collective peace and a common good that has no need for making people into victims. The organizing of followers of Jesus into faith communities across religious, ethnic, economic, and gender lines in the first centuries demonstrates the attempt to do just that. Our need to scapegoat and blame, select and sacrifice, God is determined to make sure it comes to nothing. And not only is Jesus raised from the dead, but his followers set out to make sure that comes to nothing by creating inclusive communities in his name. So from this story central to Christian faith, a story where peace is created through victims and God says no to that way of community building, I perceive a possible response to tonight's question, but reframed a bit. Instead of asking if my action is right or wrong, or deviates from an abstract good into some spectrum of evil, people of Christian faith ask if my actions create victims or stand in solidarity with them. People of Christian faith ask if my action creates community by use of blame or harm, or if it creates a kind of community that shields and protects the blamed and the harmed. People of Christian faith are aware, because of our central story, of all of the dynamics involved in sacrificing or exploiting others to build a community. And so we seek to undermine that process at work, that the victims of that process might live free from accusation and labeling and further harm. This, I would say, is a Christian way of life. It's not about determining what is right or a good course of action against some bad or evil course of action. It is about evaluating a course of ethical action in the world through the lens of the cross, which is to become aware of victimizing and scapegoating, and to live in such a way that avoids that and that protects others from those devastating effects. The good and evil, right and wrong kind of moral framework, which has been the dominant framework of our culture and has come to be a primary way Christians think about their actions, lends itself all too easily to the imperial program to make other people into enemies. It provides overly simplified categories where reflection is rarely needed, through which people who deviate might easily be seen as evil and people who conform easily viewed as good. Harm to others, especially those deemed as doing evil, becomes justified. I believe that the ethical direction given in the Christian central story gives us a different way than that approach, a different way to approach the questions and issues of our time. We have to think about who is harmed. We have to ask a question, who is the victim? Who is being ganged up on, portrayed in a negative light? Who is being blamed or scapegoated? We have to think about the dynamics of power and exploitation. We have to confront the ways in which we are involved in building community, making peace, unifying people through harming others. It does not allow us an us versus them matrix where the world is readily divided into goodies and baddies. And a cross-centered ethic, a Christian way of life, is one of coming to the support of victims and preventing the victimizers from being able to inflict harm. A new community is built as those exiled and executed in an attempt to build the kind of community that requires death are welcomed instead into an inclusive community that has no need to throw out or keep people out. As a sort of ending comment, I would say that it is interesting and curious to me that while Christianity has largely adopted throughout history that good and evil, right and wrong ethical framework, while we have been busy morality, policing people's sexuality, and causing harm to people in the name of goodness and rightness, secular society has grown in a kind of resonance with that ethical direction I perceive in the Christian central story. It is by and large in the secular realm where you hear about a concern for victims, where there is an awareness of power dynamics and how that plays into how we understand who has been harmed. Even the powerful people and nations of the world play the victim these days because they sense in some way that people might side with them if they portray themselves as the ones being hurt. I sense that secular ethics is becoming more cross-shaped as it evaluates sexual ethics in terms of consent and power differential instead of right and wrong, economic ethics in terms of who benefits and who is harmed. Secular ethics are starting to evaluate the history and future of nations and cultures in light of how community has been built on racial injustice and white supremacy and prejudice, exclusion and access. There is, of course, even in secular ethics, just as in religious ethics, that mob and sacrificial mindset, the need to define people as right or wrong and to get rid of people you disagree with to purify the community, as you all discussed in the conversation on cancel culture. But there is a sense, a growing awareness of the harm that is caused by that moral framework, I think. For Christian people, our central story and how it draws our attention to victims of this dynamic provides us with a different way of building community, a particular way of thinking about what course of action we might take when encountering the complicated and confusing in our world. A way that tries to get beyond that simplistic category of good and evil, right and wrong. A way that calls us into a way of life oriented toward victims.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. You were right. My timer went off just as you finished. Good timing. Next, our other panelist that we have tonight is Nick Hassan. Actually, it's Nick Rushdie Hassan. He's on the board of directors of the Islamic Center of the Twin Ports here in Duluth. That is the only mosque north of the Twin Cities. He teaches management information systems and business analytics at the Labovitz School of Business and Economics at the University of Minnesota in the Department of Management. He and Nani have lived in Duluth for the last 19 years. He has 6 adult children. He is studying Islam and the Quran for himself and to share with his family and friends. And Nick, I invite you to take over.
Thank you, Bob. And thank you, Reverend Jeffrey. That's a wonderful presentation. And everybody else, also thank you for spending your precious Saturday evening with us. And let me start with a disclaimer that I am not an imam or a Muslim scholar by any stretch. You know, as the introduction said, just someone who's trying to learn and practice Islam. So before we start about discussing about, you know, choosing between right and wrong or choosing good from evil, I think it's important to understand perhaps what, and I like to think that this is the Islamic point of view. What's the big deal about right and wrong? Especially in these times when, morality has become relative in many ways. What used to be bad before is no longer bad now, and so on. So in the Quran, we can find many places where God Almighty tells us why he created the universe. And without exception, they all say that this creation, the creation of the universe, is based on the truth. So one particular verse or one ayah, he says the following, and I'll read this in Arabic. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. وخلق الله السماوات والأرض بالحق ولتجزى كل نفس بما كسبت وهم لا يظلمون. And that means roughly, and God created the heavens and the earth on the truth, and so that every single person may be repaid with whatever they earned. So basically, everybody will get what they deserve, and they will not be wronged. So the phrase bil haq also means with purpose. In other words, God created the universe with purpose. So literally, one of the purposes of creation, in other words, is so that what is wrong can be made right. So the universe literally exists to establish justice. Or you can say that the creation of the universe is linked to personal ethics and morality. Now, this changes everything, because what that means is that whatever we experience, whatever that we witness happening around us, has to do with establishing what is right. All of this, of course, is counter to what we see happening with our own eyes, right? A lot of wrong and bad things happen every day. Politicians, take advantage of the public to line their coffers all the time. And now we're witnessing Putin, after lying to everyone about invading, is rolling over Ukraine, killing thousands with impunity. Now he may even win the war, and he and his generals and cronies may live in luxury, to the end of their lives. So you might ask, what is the right in that? If creation is for that purpose? Well, this is actually where we come in. So we are charged to maintain that balance of right over wrong in the creation of the universe. So just like how God holds up the universe in perfect justice and balance, we are ordered to maintain that balance. So here's another verse in the Quran, and I'll read it in Arabic again. So it goes, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. الشمس والقمر بحسبان والنجم والشجر يسجدان والسماء رفعها ووضع الميزان ألا تطغوا في الميزان, which can roughly be translated, the sun and the moon follow their orbits perfectly. The stars and the trees, they prostrate, surrendering to God. And the sky, he lifted it high, and he placed the balance, that you should not transgress in the balance. So we are supposed to right what is wrong. And in Islam, that starts with ourselves. So, we cannot be like those who see themselves as always right and others always wrong. Just like, Reverend Jeffrey mentioned, the language right and wrong tends to, as he says, cause this rift. I'm right, you're wrong, that kind of argument. Well, in the Quran, God forbids that kind of self-righteous attitude. So he says, فَلَا تُزَكُّوا أَنفُسَكُمْ هُوَ أَعْلَمُ بِمَنِ اتَّقَى. So do not claim purity for yourself. He, God, knows better who is truly righteous. So we're not privy to that, the fact what rank we hold, or whether we are completely in the right or we're, that sort of thing. So with that background, how do we handling this right and wrong? First, as the ayat just now mentioned, we cannot claim we are right. We are always right. We can only approach it. So there's the truth, and we cannot be completely, in the truth. God teaches us a prayer in the Quran again, And this prayer is taught to the sleepers of the cave, some 3 centuries before the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and about a century after Jesus. So the prayer goes, وَاذْكُرْ رَبَّكَ إِذَا نَسِيتَ وَقُلْ عَسَىٰ أَنْ يَهْدِينِ رَبِّي إِلَى أَقْرَبَ مِنْ هَذَا رَشَدًا. Which means, and remember your God when you forget, and say, may my nurturing master, my God, guide me closer than this to what is right. So in other words, we cannot claim that, we're completely right. But we can go on that journey to get closer to the truth. So that's the first, I guess, practical principle, I guess. Second, the verse says, the prayer says, we're bound to forget. In other words, through our lives, there's really no black and white in the life of a human being. In the case of right or wrong either. We're bound to make mistakes. We are complicated as human beings. And we're often a mixture of both. The issue is we have to fight against that wrong, that evil. And some of that may be even ourselves. And the Prophet, and this is where asking for forgiveness from God comes into the picture as part of the Muslim's daily practice. So the Prophet, peace be upon himself, is reported to ask for forgiveness from God at least 70 times a day. So if the Prophet does that, 70 times a day he asks for forgiveness, what about us? How many times should we be asking for forgiveness? So that's the second. I mean, there is no black and white. It's a struggle. And this is a struggle not against the persons. And this is kind of important because sometimes we tend to, as Reverend Jeffrey mentioned earlier, we tend to blame and victimize people. And no, our fight is not against the person per se. The fight is against the wrong, the behavior, in other words. That's what the fight is against, not against the personality. Who knows? Maybe Putin might change his mind and repent, and that would save millions of lives. That's what we want to see, right? So our fight is against the action that he's doing. And of course, if he doesn't change, then obviously he has to be fought against, because there are people who will not change. And we've seen that throughout history of mankind. So that's the second. The third is God has equipped us actually with the capabilities to distinguish between right and wrong. Right from when we were born. It is not built or it is not nurtured through society. It's built into us. And this is through the fact that he breathed his own spirit into us when we were born. An angel brought his spirit into our mother's womb, and we are born with the godly spirit. And that's why, it doesn't matter, any kid, if that kid hasn't been taught, that kid will never lie. That kid will never do something wrong because, that kid is innocent, coming from that godly spirit. So anyway, the guilt that we feel when we do something wrong, that restlessness that overcomes us when we venture into something we're not supposed to, that comes directly from God, and that godly spirit is in us. It's called the fitrah. But there's a condition. We're supposed to take care of the godly spirit, that fitrah. Just like, astronauts, when they can lose the ability to walk if they don't use their legs in space. Same thing, if we don't use that fitrah properly, if we violate it, we do wrong all the time, then we lose that ability that God has given us. Again, I like to mention Putin now because he's in the headlines. We don't know what's going on in his heart. But we know that when women and children are indiscriminately killed, and he's doing nothing about it, instead he's making it worse, that says something about his ability to distinguish from wrong and right. And we need to do something about that. We need to speak up. We need to, because God commands us to maintain that balance of right over wrong. All right. So life is complicated. We know, Putin killing women and children, that's wrong, clearly wrong. It's wrong to steal. It's wrong to destroy property. But there are many things in life that are not so clear. And interestingly, if we look at the Quran, if we study the Quran actually spends very little time when it comes to the things which are clear, like murder, for example. Here's the, murder, Here's the punishment. Done. Stealing, here's the punishment. Done. Here's, but the Quran spends a lot of space talking about topics that are difficult and confusing. Because why? Because the Quran is guidance for mankind. So therefore, mankind is complicated. So these confusing and difficult topics is the Quran spends a lot of time. The message from God spends a lot of time on that. So for example, divorce has its own chapter. There's a chapter called divorce in the Quran. There's a chapter, the longest verse in the Quran is actually on loans, because financial issues are complicated. And that sort of thing. And then that's interesting when the Quran talks about belief, or people who believe, that is people who are, sincere belief. Quran says, here's people who believe, they're like this. And then when Quran talks about the people who reject the truth, they're like that. But then the Quran in the second chapter rather, the Quran spends a lot of space on hypocrites. Why? Because on the surface, they appear to be following scripture, for example. They appear to saying that they're right, but underneath they're not. For example, Quran talks a lot about religious leaders in the Quran. There's a lot about it, which is interesting. Why is that so? That's important because they appear to follow scripture. They preach scripture to their flock, but instead they use the authority they get from their position to enrich themselves. So the Quran talks about that. They sell the scripture for pieces of gold, for example. So these, the Quran says, are the true hypocrites. And in the history of the world, of course, there's always religious leaders who will sell their religion for worldly gain. And they are the greatest criminals because they're very confusing. It's very difficult to distinguish people like that. Anyway, now when they do that, what they've done is they've placed themselves between God and the people. And they severed the connection that people are supposed to have directly with God. In Islam, this is called shirk, to usurp or to steal God's authority. And God has exclusive authority, and you're not supposed to mess with that. So whether it's authority to legislate what is right and wrong, God's authority to forgive, only God has that authority to do so. And ultimately, of course, to be worshipped. So anyway, so shirk in the Quran says, Inna shirka la dhulmun azim. Shirk is the greatest injustice, God says. And is one of the sins that is not forgiven by God. God forgives everything except that. Shirk. So anyway, so to kind of let me just say that shirk is also very complicated. It happens, and when it happens, it's deceptively persuasive. That's the problem, and people get swallowed into it. Anyway, so let me just close with a story of how one group of people, how they handled the decision between right and wrong. So this, again, back to the story of the sleepers of the cave, which I love this story. So anyway, so what happened was there's this bunch of young people, teenagers perhaps, young people. We don't know how old they are, but anyway, so they lived right after Jesus was gone, about 100 years after that. And what happened was this was during the oppressive Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire decided to send out into their surrounding areas governors that would force people to show their loyalty by bringing offerings to the Roman gods and whatever, and to show that they worship God and all that. So anyway, so when the Roman king, that area, reached or that city, actually that happened to be following the teachings of Jesus, they forced the people. They say, okay, you all have to bring offerings, worship this Roman gods. And the people, they of course, this was done at the threat of execution. And, let's capitulate. Let's just do whatever they want us to do. We can just pretend to worship them, and it will be done. Now, the young group, a group of young people decided, no, we're not going to do that. This is wrong. We're not going to do that. So they refused, and they stood in front of the Roman king and declared the oneness and authority of the one God. They were captured and somehow managed to escape and then they ran away and hid in a cave. Now, God made them sleep for hundreds of years. In other words, God made time stop for them. And they woke up hundreds of years after that. Of course, and by that time, they were Christianity had become powerful and everything's changed. So of course they went out to the town to get some food. They found somebody to get that, and of course they were discovered. And everybody thought, oh, this is amazing, miracles and everything. God sent them to actually correct a misunderstanding that was happening at the time during the Christian era. There was a debate whether whether people would be resurrected in spirit only, or in both spirit and body. And they became the evidence to say, yep, God will resurrect both spirit and body. No question about it. But anyway, the point is God made them, God stopped time for them. And resurrection is real. In other words, the day of judgment will happen. And resurrection is real. So the story here, the lesson here is that don't underestimate the power of choosing what is right in our lives. Because amazing things will happen if we choose what is right. And when we do that, God's help will always be with us. So that's all I got. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you very much, Nick. Thank you to both of you. Those were very engaging, at least for me. So as I said at the beginning, we will have a chance for a more full dialogue with our speakers and with each other. But I want to take a few minutes just to make sure that before we break into the two groups, that you're understanding what you heard. So a few minutes if you've got any clarifying questions to either of our speakers. So what I'd like to do first, before I open it up to general conversation, is give Nick and Jeffrey a chance to, if they've got questions for each other, or just to kind of get that, and then we'll open up for everybody.
Sure. Do you want to go first, Reverend?
I don't know. I can't read my own handwriting. I had notes down. It's pretty ugly now. So
Let's go for it.
Well, one thing that I both appreciated and wondered about is this idea that God created the world for justice, out of justice, and made human beings, as you said, into people who can move the world into greater justice through the choices that we make. And what that brought to mind is, actually, I don't know if it resonates with it or if it contrasts with it. The story in Genesis of the creation and the garden, where there's a tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that human beings aren't supposed to eat from.
Right.
So that story would seem to say that we shouldn't even know what good and evil are. And it makes for an interesting, just either a contrast, or I'm not sure how they might come together. But I thought of that story too. And there seems to be a trajectory of a natural, the world is created in justice and we are to be arbiters of justice, but also we're not even supposed to know kind of aspect of what justice might be. Right. Yeah.
Well, I'd love to answer that question. Thank you for asking that question. So the Quran has an equivalent but different narrative of what happened with Adam and Eve. So the first difference, and then there are many differences, but the first difference about that story is that the tree that was mentioned was not the tree of knowledge. So that's the first difference. So what happened was God mentioned actually told Adam, you are going to be here, and God told him and Eve that eventually you are going to be sent to the earth. In other words, they're not meant to stay in heaven. They were supposed to go down to earth. So this temporary heavenly time that they had was actually engineered, I guess, for lack of a better term, for Adam and Eve to experience evil, if you will. So what happened was, you can go anywhere in heaven, in paradise, The only thing you're not supposed to approach is this single tree. That's it. Now, of course, human nature, right? The moment you say, you can do anything you like, but don't go here. The first thing the human being will do is to go there. And and of course, the devil, Iblis, his name is mentioned in the Quran, his name is Iblis. He went to Adam and said, to both of them actually, not to Adam, to both of them, and said, okay, you know why God did not want you to go to this tree? That's because God does not want you to stay here. If you take from the tree, then you will become like the angels. You will be immortal. You will have all these other things. So in other words, he deceived Adam. So, and told him that if you did this, and this is what he's been doing throughout the centuries, he will say, yo, do this, you'll be fine. You'll be okay. So the trickery was what caused Adam to eat from the tree. And by the way, in the Quran, it wasn't Eve that seduced Adam to take from the tree. It was Adam who was, who was tricked and slipped. And of course, the Quran used the word slipped. Adam slipped, the Quran says. So it was a minor mistake. But nevertheless, it was still a disobedience that he forgot. That's the reason why in the Quran says mankind, they forget. So he kind of, there was a lapse, in other words. And because of that lapse, he tasted the first, evil, I guess, if you will, the wrong thing to do. And after that, he was sent down to earth, and both of them were sent down, and the devil was sent down as well. And they will battle each other on earth. This is the reason why, this whole history of mankind, the battle between good and evil and all that, of course, started there. But just to add just one more, because you mentioned the part about when the creation of Adam and Eve was God mentioned it actually before they were created. God mentioned it to the angels. So God says, I am going to create a vice regent on earth. I'm going to create somebody who's going to replace the previous creation on earth. And then the angels actually asked God, do you want to create a being that will spill blood and spread corruption? In other words, in a way, and God says, I know what you do not know. God replied to the angels. Okay. And then the angels replied back, Subhanak, glory be to you. We of course, we do not know anything unless you have taught us, you have, whatever you've given us. We are asking, in other words, we are asking because we're wondering, why do you want to do this? Right? So the point here is that even the creation of mankind was actually a controversial issue among the angels. It was like, they're this kind of people, this kind of being, but God knew something else that the angels did not, that mankind was capable of feats even beyond what the angels could do. And of course, the angels will not know this. So some of the interpreters of the Quran, they discussed this and explained. But the point is, it's complicated. Even our creation is complicated, to the point that the angels even asked God about that. So anyway, just wanted to answer that question. So yes, there is no tree of knowledge. It was trickery on part of the devil to do that. And here we are.
Nick. All right. Did you see the strong reaction you got from Diane about letting Eve off the hook?
Yes, the Quran definitely took Eve off the hook. Yeah.
Okay. Any questions you have for Jeffrey from his presentation?
All right. So I guess my question is, I understand where you're coming from, but what would you do to a situation where there are people on earth that will not change, that we know will, if we do not put a stop to it, will cause so much harm and trouble to the humanity. So in this way, how does in your terms, the way of the cross handles that situation where you've got this, terrible people, evil people, if you will, right? So how do we handle that?
Well, that's kind of a big one, Nick. As was mentioned in the intro, I fancy myself a student of a Lutheran theologian named Dietrich Bonhoeffer, as some people might be familiar with, who was a Lutheran pastor and a scholar in Germany during the Nazi period. And since he's part of my own heritage, I can speak at least from his mindset of when faced with a person who was corrupting his nation, especially in regards to their attitude toward the Jewish people. He aided the victims of that tyrant in trying to help Jewish people escape Germany. But he also involved himself in a conspiracy to assassinate Adolf Hitler. But his reasoning was not, it's the right thing to do. He could not bring himself to say that. In fact, in some of his writings in a book called Ethics, he tries to do, in a way, what I had in mind a little bit in this presentation, is get beyond categorizing things in terms of good and bad, or evil and good, right and wrong. And he adopts a framework of responsibility, that in order to protect people, in order to rescue people from being victimized, he has to do what must be done.
Right.
And there's no calling it good. It's just something that you do and you accept responsibility for. And that's something that happened to him. He was arrested and imprisoned for a few years, and eventually executed days before his camp was liberated. And that was his framework, is I will do what the responsible thing is. And he said something like, the one who acts responsibly becomes guilty. You do what maybe other people say is wrong, or what other people might see as right, but ultimately you do what you think will protect people, and bear the consequences that are inflicted upon you for doing that, in the service of helping others.
Yeah.
So I think that's one way to approach the question, I think, is instead of thinking about it, well, is it the right thing or wrong thing to go to war, or whatever it might be? Well, what's the responsible thing? What will help the people who are being harmed?
And that resonates very well with the Islamic teachings that I understand. The fact that we are on earth means that we have been given that responsibility. That there is no question about it. And I mean, when I talk to students at the university, when they ask me to talk about Islam, I ask them to hold up their hand in front of them and say, "Did you pay for your hands?" Did you pay for your hands? And of course, all of them say, "No, we didn't pay for our hands." Well, guess what? It was given to you, and with it comes responsibility. And that responsibility, of course, carries on with everything that's given to us, not just our hands. And as you said, I mean, if it is, when something like that happens, then it is our responsibility to do something about that. And I would argue that doing that is the right thing to do. Now, of course, right and good, the language is semantics now, but that would be the right thing to do. And there's circumstances where it can be painful, right? But it's still the right thing to do. There, for example, in Islam, there's capital punishment, right? But in Islam also there's forgiveness. So for example, let's say, if somebody gets murdered and the murderer is convicted and is guilty and all that, there is no automatic death penalty. So the family has the option of forgiving the murderer. So the family can say, okay, well, I'll take in replacement of capital punishment, I'll take, like a, amount of money, whatever, to make it right. So, or I will just forgive you. So that option is given. But the responsibility of the state and the people to punish that person still does not go away. The forgiveness can happen, but nevertheless, somebody still needs to be said, yeah, you're guilty, you're wrong, whatever you did is wrong. Because once that goes away, then society is gone. That is
Nick, I'm going to cut you off, Nick,
yeah, sure.
because I want to let other people have a chance to jump in as well. So
Thank you.
we have about 15 minutes. So I want to open it up for any discussion and maybe to hear some of what came out of the small group, the breakout rooms.
Nick?
Yeah.
Tell us about Iblis. Is Iblis alive and well and roaming the countryside? And what's the metaphysics and practical implications of Iblis?
Right.
Society? We got plenty of devil talk, but how does Iblis fit into?
Okay. So the word
Maybe
Iblis,
tell us who Iblis is.
Yes. So Iblis is the name given by God to that being.
Okay.
And he is not a fallen angel, unlike some scriptures might say. That is, angels do not disobey God by nature. They do not, and they are in service of God. So Iblis is not of angelic nature. He is actually of the jinn, and the jinn is a being that existed before we existed, before we were created. They existed before us, eons perhaps, the jinn. Now the jinn is also given a choice, just like us. So their choice meaning that free will, in the sense that they can disobey, they will disobey, in other words. So compare it like, the sun, for example. Right? The sun obeys God. The sun will never disobey God. So I guess the metaphysics of that is that creation, nature, in a sense, obeys God completely, surrenders to God. So the two beings that we know of that have the choice of disobeying, or make the choice of disobeying God, is Iblis and us. Sorry, the jinn and us, not Iblis. Anyway, so what happened was, he is created out of smokeless fire. We are created out of dirt. So that's the physics of it, meaning that he can do things we cannot do. Obviously, he can fly, and he can take different shapes. Things that jinn can do, we cannot do. But the thing about the Iblis was that just before he had reached the ranks so high up that he was in the company of the angels. And this is the reason why there's confusion between him and the angels, because he had reached that rank. Now, what happened was, when in that situation, God decided to create a new being. And at that time, that new being is now supposed to take over the custodianship of earth, custodianship of the world. And he said to God, he says, why did you do that? He actually literally, he was talking face to face to God. He says, I am better than him. You created him. You created me from fire, and you created him from dirt. So racism started basically there, if you will, by nature of the person. So the materialistic mindset is already there. The fact that, because I am like this, therefore I'm better than you. And then he asks permission from God. He says, God, give me time, and I will show you that he is not worth you doing whatever you're doing. And God said, yes, I will give you respite. I will give you that time. And yes, he is living. He is that same Iblis. Of course, by the time now, he has his millions and millions of children that follow him. And every time a human being is born, and a shaitan is born with the child. So everyone has his own shaitan. So shaitan is the followers of Iblis. What else can I tell you? Let me think.
Can we maybe allow for another question?
Yeah, go ahead. Let me stop. There's a lot to share when it comes to Iblis. There's lots of.
I could tell, Nick, the passion you're showing is amazing. But I want to make sure everybody has the time if they have questions.
Go for it. I hope I answered some of the questions, Bob. The other Bob.
Are you good? Okay, thank you. Anyone else? We've got about 10 minutes here.
The issue, of course, was if you don't believe in the devil, just read the paper and then we'll talk.
So what's interesting about that, I can't resist this. Another Bob mentioned that is that so the devil becomes stronger when that person follows him, and so they take similar. It's called a qarin. They will take similar behaviors. And as Bob mentioned there just now, just read the papers and you'll see some of them.
Well, it reminds me of, and Bruce, help me out here, that story. I don't know what ancient tradition, whether it's Native American, I'm not sure, about the two wolves. And the one gets stronger is the one you feed.
Yes. That's right.
Yeah, I love that story. I have a question for the two of you. The word that kept coming to mind as I'm listening to both of you is humility. So I'm wondering, what is the role of humility about God, about our own beliefs, about the arguments we make? How does that play in?
Well, I think that in a way is where my comment regarding the Genesis story of the tree of good and evil comes from, is that at the creation of the world, there's this tree of good and evil that we're not supposed to eat from, and that in many ways we're supposed to be oblivious to what is good and what is evil and what is right and what is wrong. And I think what that could entail is a basic humility when it comes to these questions of not falling into the trap that I know what is a right course, because as soon as I figure out that I'm in the right, somebody else is in the wrong. And this kind of connects with the devil talk in a way. Satan, one definition of the Satan is the accuser. And so when we become representatives of what's good and right, we so often become accusers of others, blaming them for what's going wrong in the world and in our lives and such. So I think humility is, maybe that's supposed to be sort of the primal posture human beings are supposed to live in. This obliviousness to good and evil, or our own good and evil, and not relying too heavily on that.
So I guess the way I see it, and get my humble opinion, the way I see it is that in order to one has to ensure or try your best to be on the right. That doesn't mean you might get it right. You might get it wrong, but you still have to give it a go. You have to try your best to be on the right. And the way to do that is by the use of evidence. In other words, we're not supposed to just blindly follow anything. We cannot blindly follow anything. We have to check, we have to ask, we have to seek that evidence. Once we have that evidence, then we stick to the evidence as far as we know. Maybe down the road, a month later, we might change our mind and we find a better evidence, for example. So we're always open to being improved or being actually being told to be wrong. So there's I think I mentioned this in one of the talks before in the past session. So Imam Shafi'i, for example, this is one of his sayings. He says, when I discuss with someone, he says, I will pray that the truth will come from his mouth and not me. So that is the kind of attitude that, you stick to what you think is right, but at the same time, when you sit down and talk to someone, your wish is that you will learn from the other person rather than you trying to impose your opinion on the other person. So even debates and discussions follow that sincerity. And it's all about sincerity, really. It's about being sincere, because when you're sincere, you will not accuse someone. You will not throw him under, say bad things, whatever it is, because you're sincere. You're trying to be sincere. So that's where I think, yeah.
Thank you, Nick.
All right.
We've got about 5 minutes here.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Nick. I just wanted to say I took the liberty of posting in the chat this poem by Yehuda Amichai that I've always loved and associated with interfaith dialogue, and heard it used in that context before. But when you were talking about humility, the essential humility of being human and confronting these kinds of questions, I thought of that poem. Anyway, I wanted to post it.
Thank you,
Thank
Bruce.
you, Bruce.
It's beautiful.
That's really nice. Yeah.
And it strikes me, if we spent less time in judgment, less time judging what is right, wrong, good, evil, and more in conversation about understanding, not necessarily agreeing, but understanding, where would we be then?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I like that. That's absolutely right. It's judge. In fact, that's why that Quranic verse I mentioned, "Wala tuzakku anfusakum," do not judge yourself to be pure. We don't have the authority to do that. So yeah. I wonder if Jonathan, I'm trying to put somebody on the spot here.
I knew you would.
So Jonathan's a good friend, and he's been following the sessions all this while. So I'm curious as to what he's come up with after listening to all that.
Oh, it's a tricky topic for sure. I mean, it's tough to know what is moral and what is not. It's easier to look back on and see what you did right and what you did wrong, but going forward, what is going to make the path to enlightenment? I just know where I make mistakes because I can see them, but where to head is always tricky. So that's kind of what I'm pondering.
Well, I think you're way ahead of us, because if you can actually see your mistakes after you've done that, that's even better than a lot of people. A lot of people don't even see their mistakes after they've committed them. So the if you realize, oh man, I'm gonna mistake, that's great. That's better than a lot of people.
It
Thanks.
reminds me of that saying, it's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Maybe we should have a special session on Iblis and the devil, right? That would be cool.
I did, if there's just a few minutes left, Nick, when you're talking, I I know you were getting onto the topic of shirk, and
Yeah,
yeah, I think ran out of time. I'm just curious if you had a few minutes to just say what it is about that you were going to say, perhaps. In what time we
well, yeah, there's a lot to talk about.
you talked about it as deceptively persuasive. I guess that's
Yes.
the phrase that caught my
Yes,
attention.
yes.
What you
yes.
meant by that.
So during here's an example of how it's deceptively persuasive. So after Moses was sent to the Mount Tur to receive the tablets for the Torah, he left Harun with his flock, right? And so he went for 40 days. It's a long time. And during that time, what happened was one guy decided to create trouble. His name is Samari. And what he did was he claimed, this is what he claimed after Moses came back. He told everybody, he says, Moses forgot about you. We have to do our own thing now. We have to worship God. So basically what he did was he persuaded the people that we must continue to worship God. We don't have to depend on Moses. He's gone. We don't know what's happening to him. So let's collect all the precious metals and everything, and then make this godly symbol, he said. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the traces of the prophets' traces. So he mixed a lot of things together. And then he took the traces of the prophets, meaning the footsteps of the prophets, put it together with the metal. And that's when he created that golden calf, which was later, of course, worshipped. They saw that, according to the Mufassirin, they actually went past a group of people that actually worship the calves. And that's where the whole calf thing came into the picture. Anyway, so when Moses came down, Moses said, what have you done? Why? And then he says, well, I was inspired to do this. So this is the thing. When somebody claims that they're inspired, they've taken the authority of God. And that's shirk. You cannot put anything between you and God. It doesn't matter whether it's a human being, somebody who's saintly, God, whatever it is, you cannot do that. Because when you start doing that, that's when the oneness of God loses, in your heart, that goes away, and your connection with God is severed. So that's what going to explain. That's what shirk does. So, and shirk is the root of all evil.
Yeah. Thank you, and thank you for putting it in the form of a story.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we are to the end of our time. I want to thank everybody for coming and engaging in this conversation. I want to thank Jeffrey and Nick for your part on the panel, and Nick especially for the Islamic Center for initiating this series so that people from the community can come together around various topics. This one for me was very engaging tonight, and thank you for that. And do you want to say a little bit, Nick, about April?
So we're going to continue. We're changing up a little bit of topics because we want it to better resonate with our everyday life. So I've gotten some survey. If you haven't answered the survey that I sent out, please do that. We're going to collect some new topics and maybe change some of the topics that we have right now. And there is next month the next session, which is on, I think it's on the challenges to organized religion, if I'm not mistaken. That's the next one, right, Bob? It's yours, isn't it?
No, Jeff wanted to do that one.
That's right. That's right. So we've got three wonderful panelists who's going to be joining us on that one. So we hope to see more. Obviously, if you want, we would like you to encourage your congregations and your friends and family to join us in our.
Do we have a date on that, Nick, or
yes.
Not yet?
Yep, we do. It's actually on the website. And let me just bring it up here. It's always the second Saturday of the month. And
So that would be April 9th, I think.
April 9th.
correct, April 9th. That's what it is.
Yep.
Yep.
Okay.
Is it okay to share this link with friends and family who I think would
Oh,
be interested?
absolutely.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. That's the whole point. So
That's a good idea.
Yeah. So let me just, it's April 9th, and it's we got Pastor Janine Alexander from the First United Methodist Church,
Methodist.
our Coppertop Church, Bishop Amy Ogren, and I'm hoping that we can get one more to add to that, including a Muslim representative as well. So look out for announcements coming through to your email box.
Okay.
Thank you, Bob, for being a wonderful, wonderful moderator.
Well, we're learning the technology. So, and actually, Nick, if you and Jeffrey could stay on and we can do a little debrief.
Wonderful.
Everybody
We'll do
else.
that.
So
Thank you, everyone.
have a good evening, the rest of your evening, everybody. And thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.